Ivan the Terrible. Chapter 1. The Boy Prince. In the heart of Moscow, where the bells of countless churches echoed across the Kremlin walls, a child was born who would one day shape the destiny of Russia. His name was Ivan, son of Vasily III, Grand Prince of Moscow. The year was 1530, a summer night heavy with storms, and the people whispered that such weather was a sign. A child born beneath lightning and thunder would carry both power and turmoil in his soul. Ivan's early years were marked not by warmth or protection, but by shadows of courtly intrigue. His father, Vasily, had long fought to strengthen Moscow's rule over the Russian lands, but he died when Ivan was only 3 years old. The great halls of the Kremlin fell silent, and the boy, too young to grasp his fate, was declared Grand Prince of Moscow. The crown, glittering and heavy, rested upon the head of a child who still clutched toys in his hands. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, tried to rule in his stead. She was strong, determined, and intelligent, seeking to preserve her son's fragile throne. But the boyars, the great noble families of Russia, saw opportunity in the vulnerability of a child sovereign. They whispered in corridors, plotted in chambers, and drew invisible daggers in the air. The Kremlin, once a fortress of order, became a den of serpents. When Ivan was only 8 years old, his mother died suddenly, poisoned, many believed, by the very nobles who sought power. For young Ivan, the world collapsed. He and his younger brother Yuri were left alone, vulnerable, and at the mercy of those who were supposed to serve them. The boyars ruled the court not with wisdom, but with greed. They used the Grand Prince's palace as their playground, feasting on luxuries while the heirs of Moscow wandered neglected. Ivan often found himself hungry, clothed in rags, while noble families displayed their wealth before his eyes. Servants ignored him, courtiers mocked him, and those who once bowed before his father now laughed at his orphaned son. And yet, from these bitter years, something unshakable grew within him. Alone, Ivan found solace in books. The great libraries of the Kremlin, filled with chronicles of saints, heroes, and rulers, became his refuge. He read of the mighty princes of old, of Alexander Nevsky, who had stood against the Teutonic Knights, of Byzantine emperors who ruled with both sword and scripture. He learned of kings who demanded obedience, of Tsars who ruled as God's chosen. And in these pages, the boy discovered a truth: to be weak was to be devoured. The child who once trembled in the dark began to dream of light, but not the gentle light of dawn. No, Ivan dreamed of the blinding fire of power, the kind that scorched all who dared stand against it. By the time he was a teenager, Ivan had learned to play the part of the silent observer. He spoke little, watched everything, and hid his rage beneath a mask of calm. But when the mask slipped, flashes of cruelty emerged. Stories spread of young Ivan tossing small animals from the Kremlin walls, or ordering servants beaten for failing him. Whether these tales were truth or legend, they revealed a boy who had absorbed both the violence of his court and the loneliness of his heart. And yet, he was not without tenderness. In moments away from the cruelty of boyars, Ivan showed a deep fascination with the rituals of the church. He listened intently to priests, studied Holy Scripture, and prayed with fervor. To him, faith became not just a comfort, but a weapon, a divine shield. He began to believe that his destiny was not his own, but chosen by God. That the Grand Prince of Moscow was more than a ruler. He was a vessel of divine will. The city of Moscow, too, bore witness to the boy's transformation. Its streets, crowded with merchants and pilgrims, bustled with life, but whispers always lingered. "The young prince watches," they said. "He remembers." And in the eyes of Ivan, sharp as winter frost, many saw both promise and threat. By 14, Ivan's patience with his boyar oppressors began to fracture. One winter's night, when the halls of the Kremlin rang with drunken laughter, he summoned several of the nobles who had long tormented him. With a coldness that shocked even those accustomed to blood, Ivan ordered them torn apart by hunting dogs. The boy, once neglected and mocked, now revealed his fangs. It was not yet the reign of terror he would one day unleash, but it was the first taste of the wrath that would make him known as Grozny, the Terrible. And so, the child of storms became a prince of shadows. His childhood, scarred by betrayal and cruelty, shaped him into a ruler who trusted no one, feared no weakness, and believed that mercy was a lie told by the powerless. In the silence of the Kremlin's high towers, Ivan often gazed across the white stone city, dreaming of what he might one day create and what he might destroy. For he knew that when the time came, he would not be a puppet like his youth had forced him to be. He would be master, sovereign, and scourge. Thus begins the story of Ivan IV, the boy prince who would become Tsar of all Russia, remembered forever as Ivan the Terrible.
Chapter 2: Crown and Power. The boy who had grown amidst betrayal and cruelty did not remain a boy for long. By the winter of 1547, Ivan had reached his 17th year, an age when most princes of Europe were still guided by tutors and regents. But Ivan was no ordinary prince, and Russia was no ordinary realm. He had endured hunger, humiliation, and neglect. He had watched the boyars tear at each other like wolves over a carcass. He had seen the church kneel in silence, the people suffer, and the land fracture beneath the weight of greed. Out of this chaos, he had forged his resolve. He would seize power not as a grand prince, but as something greater. It was January, bitter and cold, when Moscow gathered for the grand ceremony. In the Cathedral of the Dormition, beneath the high, painted domes, Ivan was crowned not simply as Grand Prince of Moscow, but as Tsar, the first ruler of Russia to bear the title. He stood beneath the icons of Christ and the saints, dressed in robes heavy with gold, the cap of Monomach upon his head, and a scepter in his hand. The air trembled with chants and incense, and the boy who had once been mocked by nobles now stood as God's anointed ruler. The word Tsar carried weight far beyond that of Grand Prince. It linked Ivan to the legacy of the Caesars of Rome and the emperors of Byzantium. In his coronation, he declared to the world that Moscow was not merely a city-state, but the heart of a new empire, the Third Rome, destined to succeed where Constantinople had fallen. The boyars, forced to bow before him, knew that something had shifted. No longer was Ivan a child in their grasp. He was a sovereign who claimed divine authority. Yet, for all his newfound majesty, Ivan did not rule alone. At his side stood a council known as the Chosen Council, the Izbranaya Rada. Comprised of trusted advisors, priests, and reformers, it helped guide the young Tsar in his early years. Unlike the greedy boyars who had tormented his childhood, These men sought to strengthen the state, to create order from the chaos. Together, Ivan and his council began to reshape Russia. They reformed the army, replacing the unreliable service of noble militias with a more organized structure of professional soldiers. They revised laws, codifying justice to limit corruption. They sought to bring fairness to courts and reduce the power of local tyrants. For a time, it seemed as though Ivan would not be remembered for terror, but for justice. The people, weary of chaos, looked upon their Tsar with hope. They believed that God had chosen him to bring order, to protect the land from both internal strife and foreign enemies. And for a brief shining moment, that hope seemed justified. But Ivan's rule was not forged only in law and ceremony. It was also forged in fire. For even as he reformed, he prepared for war. His gaze turned westward, to the lands of the Baltic Sea, the gateway to Europe's trade and wealth. Russia, vast and mighty, was landlocked, hemmed in by hostile powers. Ivan dreamed of breaking that prison, of giving his nation a window to the sea. Thus began the Livonian War, a conflict that would define much of his reign. But in these early years, the campaign had not yet consumed him. Instead, Ivan still carried within him the vigor of youth and the vision of a great state. He dreamed not of cruelty, but of glory, not of destruction, but of creation. Amid these dreams, another light shone in his life: Anastasia Romanovna. She was noble by birth, but gentle in spirit, a woman of grace and kindness. Ivan, so long hardened by betrayal, found in her a rare warmth. Their marriage, celebrated in the Kremlin, was not merely a political union, but a bond of genuine affection. For the first time, the Tsar who had grown in shadows felt the glow of love. Anastasia's presence softened him. Those who knew Ivan during these years spoke of a ruler who could be merciful, even tender in her company. She calmed his rages, tempered his suspicions, and reminded him that power need not always be cruel. Together, they walked the gardens of the Kremlin, their hands entwined, their laughter carrying across the snowy courtyards. For a brief time, Russia had not only a Tsar, but a Tsaritsa who humanitized him in the eyes of the people. And yet, beneath this harmony, shadows remained. Ivan never forgot his childhood wounds, never ceased to see enemies lurking in the corners of his court. The boyars who bowed to him as Tsar bowed with clenched jaws, their loyalty forced, not earned. Ivan knew this, and though he smiled in ceremony, suspicion smoldered within him like an ember waiting for breath. The church, too, stood watchful. While Ivan saw himself as God's chosen ruler, there were those who whispered that his ambitions strained the bonds of faith. To rule as Tsar was to walk a narrow path, between the holiness of anointed power and the sin of human pride. Ivan, so fervent in prayer and scripture, believed he was chosen by God to shape Russia's destiny. But in that conviction lay the seeds of his future cruelty. For, if he ruled with divine mandate, then to oppose him was not merely treason, it was heresy. Thus, the young Tsar stood at the threshold of greatness. Crowned in splendor, guided by reform, strengthened by love, he appeared to his people as a ruler both just and powerful. The fires of his childhood still smoldered within him, but they had not yet erupted into the infernos that history would remember. And so, in the dawn of his reign, Ivan IV, Vasilievich, the boy who had once scorned and neglected, stood at the height of promise. The city of Moscow gleamed with hope, the bells rang with joy, and the people whispered prayers that their Tsar would be the shepherd of Russia's greatness. Little did they know that the same hand that lifted the scepter in blessing would, in years to come, unleash storms of wrath. By the time he was a teenager,
Ivan had learned to play the part of the silent observer. He spoke little, watched everything, and hid his rage beneath a mask of calm. But when the mask slipped, flashes of cruelty emerged. Stories spread of young Ivan tossing small animals from the Kremlin walls, ordering servants beaten for failing him. Whether these tales were truth or legend, they revealed a boy who had absorbed both the violence of his court and the loneliness of his heart. And yet, he was not without tenderness. In moments away from the cruelty of boyars, Ivan showed a deep fascination with the rituals of the church. He listened intently to priests, studied Holy Scripture, and prayed with fervor. To him, faith became not just a comfort, but a weapon, a divine shield. He began to believe that his destiny was not his own, but chosen by God. That the Grand Prince of Moscow was more than a ruler. He was a vessel of divine will. The city of Moscow, too, bore witness to the boy's transformation. Its streets, crowded with merchants and pilgrims, bustled with life, but whispers always lingered. The young prince watches, they said. He remembers. And in the eyes of Ivan, sharp as winter frost, many saw both promise and threat. By 14, Ivan's patience with his boyar oppressors began to fracture. One winter's night, when the halls of the Kremlin rang with drunken laughter, he summoned several of the nobles who had long tormented him. With a coldness that shocked even those accustomed to blood, Ivan ordered them torn apart by hunting dogs. The boy, once neglected and mocked, now revealed his fangs. It was not yet the reign of terror he would one day unleash, but it was the first taste of the wrath that would make him known as Grozny, the Terrible. And so, the child of storms became a prince of shadows. His childhood, scarred by betrayal and cruelty, shaped him into a ruler who trusted no one, feared no weakness, and believed that mercy was a lie told by the powerless. In the silence of the Kremlin's high towers, Ivan often gazed across the white stone city, dreaming of what he might one day create and what he might destroy. For he knew that when the time came, he would not be a puppet like his youth had forced him to be. He would be master, sovereign, and scourge. Thus begins the story of Ivan IV, the boy prince who would become Tsar of all Russia, remembered forever as Ivan the Terrible.
Chapter 3. The Young Tsar and Anastasia. In the early years of his reign, when the fires of suspicion still smoldered but had not yet engulfed him, Ivan found a rare source of peace. Her name was Anastasia Romanovna Zakharina, a noblewoman of the Romanov clan. Unlike the scheming boyars who surrounded the throne, Anastasia was known for her quiet kindness, her grace, and her devotion to faith. Their marriage in 1547 was a turning point in the young Tsar's life. It was not merely a political arrangement, though her family's loyalty strengthened Ivan's position. No, for Ivan, who had grown up without the warmth of parents, Anastasia became more than a consort. She became his confidant, his companion, and her anchor. Moscow celebrated their union with festivals and bells that rang across the city. The people, who so often bore the weight of their ruler's ambitions, rejoiced at the sight of a Tsar genuinely devoted to his Tsaritsa. Together, they appeared as a vision of harmony. Ivan, tall and austere, carrying the burden of kingship, and Anastasia, gentle and radiant, softening the severity of his presence. Within the Kremlin's white stone walls, their life was filled with moments that softened the iron of Ivan's heart. The Tsar, so often feared even in youth, would sit beside Anastasia, listening to her voice as she read from the scriptures or sang hymns. In her presence, the storms of his temper calmed, and for a time, he seemed capable of ruling with both strength and mercy. It was said that Anastasia's laughter could transform the mood of an entire hall. She reminded Ivan that kindness could command as surely as fear. She tempered her cruelty, counseled patience when his suspicions flared, and reminded him of the humanity in those he ruled. To the people of Russia, she was more than a Tsaritsa. She was the heart that balanced the mind of the Tsar. But the outside world did not rest. Russia, under Ivan's crown, was a land of vast ambition. The Livonian War loomed, promising to bring glory or ruin. Yet in these early years, Ivan's focus remained divided between governance and the warmth of his home. For the first time, the ruler of Russia was also a husband, and soon a father. When Anastasia bore him children, the Kremlin's towers echoed with joy. For Ivan, who had grown up without security, the sight of his own heirs brought both comfort and purpose. He dreamed of building a Russia strong enough to protect them, a Russia that would no longer be at the mercy of foreign armies or internal treachery. It was also in these years that Ivan's reign seemed most promising. With Anastasia's influence, he leaned toward reforms rather than reprisals. The chosen council continued its work, strengthening law, centralizing authority, and building institutions that could support the growing might of the Tsardom. Moscow expanded its reach, swallowing neighboring territories, while the seeds of empire took root. And yet, shadows crept quietly at the edges of this golden time. Ivan's suspicion of the boyars never truly faded, though Anastasia's gentle hand often calmed his anger. He would sit in silence after meetings, his dark eyes searching for betrayal in the smallest gesture. Even as he held Anastasia close, his heart harbored the memory of a childhood scarred by plots and poison. Still, Anastasia's presence held him steady. Foreign envoys who visited the Russian court in these years remarked upon the unusual balance of the Tsar. They saw a man capable of cruelty, but restrained by his queen. They saw a ruler who could be merciful in judgment, inspired by her counsel. The English, the Poles, the Germans, all who entered Moscow in those days noted that Russia, though vast and harsh, had a sovereign who seemed guided by more than ambition alone. But history, ever restless, does not linger in peace. Tragedy, like a wolf in the snow, waits for the moment when the fire burns low. For Ivan, that moment came with the illness of Anastasia. At first, it seemed no more than a passing fever, a sickness that might lift with the changing of the season. Yet as weeks passed, her strength withered. The doctors and healers of Moscow tried every remedy, herbs, prayers, charms, but none could save her. Ivan watched helplessly as the woman who had steadied his soul, who had given him warmth against the cold of suspicion, slipped away before his eyes. When Anastasia died in 1560, the Kremlin fell silent. The bells that had once rung for their marriage now tolled in mourning. Ivan, once a ruler balanced between ambition and mercy, collapsed into grief. He raged against his court, accusing the boyars of poisoning her, just as they had poisoned his mother years before. Whether truth or paranoia, the suspicion consumed him. The Tsar, who had found peace in love, now found only bitterness in loss. His heart, once softened by Anastasia's presence, hardened into iron once more. And though Russia still looked to him for guidance, the man who had ruled with hope now began to turn toward fear. In the years that followed, Ivan's reign would darken. The gentle balance Anastasia had provided was gone, and in its place rose the shadows of suspicion, vengeance, and terror. For though love had made Ivan human, loss would make him Grozny, the terrible.
Chapter 4. Dreams of a Strong Russia. In the wake of his coronation and his marriage, Ivan IV looked beyond the walls of the Kremlin and saw not just a principality, but a vast and restless land waiting to be forged into greatness. Russia, sprawling with forests, rivers, and plains, was powerful in size but fractured in spirit. Centuries of Mongol domination,
rival princes, and boyar intrigues had left scars upon its people. To unite them, to make Russia more than a land of fragmented loyalties, Ivan believed it was his divine mission to create a state strong enough to rival any kingdom of Europe. From the beginning, his vision was clear. Russia would not remain a loose collection of lands tied together only by allegiance to Moscow. No, it would become a centralized realm, a tsardom where the ruler's word stretched from the Volga to the White Sea, from the Ural Mountains to the Baltic frontier. And it would be bound not by fragile oaths, but by law, faith, and the iron hand of authority. The chosen council, his circle of trusted advisors, was instrumental in these early reforms. Men like Alexei Adashev and the priest Sylvester guided the young Tsar, offering both practical wisdom and spiritual counsel. With their help, Ivan created new structures of governance designed to break the power of the boyars who had tormented his childhood. Land was redistributed to loyal service nobles, ensuring that loyalty flowed upward to the Tsar, not sideways to old feudal families. One of his most lasting achievements in these years was the Sudebnik of 1550, a revised law code. It aimed to standardize justice across his lands, curbing the corruption and arbitrary judgments of local lords. For the peasantry, long oppressed by shifting taxes and cruel governors, this brought a fragile hope that law might shield them from the greed of the powerful. The church, too, was drawn into his vision. Ivan convened the Stoglavi Sobor, the Council of 100 Chapters, in 1551. It reformed clerical practices, regulated monasteries, and sought to unify religious customs across Russia. For Ivan, faith was not simply private devotion, but the backbone of his rule. By presenting himself as God's chosen sovereign, he bound the destiny of his state to divine will. The Church, in turn, sanctified his authority, strengthening his image as a ruler unlike any before him. But reforms were not only about laws and rituals. Ivan dreamed of transforming Moscow into a capital that rivaled the splendor of Constantinople. The Kremlin, already formidable, was expanded and adorned. And in the heart of Red Square, construction began on a cathedral unlike any the world had seen before. A blaze of colors and shapes that seemed to capture the fire of heaven itself. This was the Cathedral of the Intercession on the Moat, known today as St. Basil's. Its onion domes, rising like painted flames against the sky, became both a prayer in stone and a symbol of Russia's growing might. Foreign observers arising in Moscow marveled at these transformations. They saw a court that mixed Eastern traditions with Western ambitions. A city that was both medieval fortress and budding empire. They wrote of the Tsar, who dreamed in the language of destiny, who spoke not of Moscow as a city, but of Russia as a power ordained to rival the kingdoms of Christendom. But Ivan's vision was not confined within borders. He looked outward, to the Volga River, the lifeline of trade and conquest. The Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, remnants of the once mighty Golden Horde, stood as symbols of Mongol domination that still lingered over Russia. Ivan resolved to bring them down. The campaigns against Kazan were brutal but decisive. In 1552, after long battles and a final siege, Kazan fell to the armies of the Tsar. Ivan himself rode at the head of his forces, his banners fluttering as the city burned. The conquest was not merely territorial, it was symbolic. The yoke of the Tatars, which had weighed upon Russia for centuries, was broken. The victory was celebrated as a triumph of Christ over Islam, of Moscow's destiny over its past humiliation. 3 years later, Astrakhan too was brought under Ivan's rule, giving Russia control of the lower Volga and opening the road to the Caspian.
For the first time, Russia stood not as a vassal of steppe powers, but their conqueror. The people hailed their Tsar as the unifier of the realm, the avenger of old wounds, and the bringer of glory. In these years, Ivan's star burned brightest. His reforms strengthened the heart of his state. His wars expanded its reach, and his cathedral rose as a monument to his vision. The boy who had once been humiliated now stood as a ruler whose power stretched farther than any Russian before him. And yet, even in this time of triumph, shadows gathered. The Livonian War, which Ivan launched in 1558, promised to give Russia a gateway to the Baltic Sea, to trade, to wealth, to Europe itself. But wars have a way of draining more than they give. As Ivan poured men and treasure into the struggle, the strain began to fracture the fragile harmony he had built. And, in the heart of the Kremlin, the one light that steadied him, Anastasia, began to dim. Her illness, her decline, and her death would soon unravel the Tsar's balance. For, though Ivan dreamed of a strong Russia, his vision would become clouded by grief, suspicion, and rage. The fire that once promised to forge an empire would turn inward, consuming not just his enemies, but his own people.
Chapter 5. War and Ambition. In the wake of his triumphs on the Volga, Ivan IV stood as a conqueror. Kazan and Astrakhan were now jewels in the crown of Moscow, and the steppe had been humbled. Yet, for all his victories, the Tsar's gaze stretched further still. He did not want Russia to remain a landlocked realm, hemmed in by forests and rivers. He hungered for the sea, the lifeblood of commerce, power, and prestige in Europe. To secure Russia's future, Ivan dreamed of a window to the west. That window, he believed, lay on the shores of the Baltic. Beyond the forests and rivers of Livonia, ships sailed to the Hanseatic ports of Lubeck and Hamburg, to London, and to the far reaches of the Atlantic. Merchants grew rich on this trade, kings grew powerful, and Ivan, with all his ambition, longed to join them. The Baltic was the key to transforming Russia from a land power into a maritime empire. And so, in 1558, the Livonian War began. At first, fortune favored the Tsar. His armies, seasoned by victories over Kazan and Astrakhan, swept into Livonian lands with fire and steel. Castles fell, towns burned, and the once proud Livonian order crumbled before the might of Moscow. Ivan's banners were carried across the Baltic frontier, and Russian horsemen roamed as far as the gates of Riga. For a time, it seemed his dream of a Russian port on the sea was within reach. But wars are not won by battles alone. Livonia was no longer the isolated knightly order of old. Its collapse drew the attention of greater powers. Poland, Lithuania, Sweden, and Denmark, kingdoms wary of Moscow's growing might, all turned their eyes toward the struggle. One by one, they entered the conflict, and what began as Ivan's bold thrust to the sea became a grinding war against a coalition of rivals. The Livonian War dragged on for decades, draining Russia's strength. The Baltic dream slipped further away as foreign armies pushed back against Moscow's gains. Each campaign brought not glory, but exhaustion, famine, and discontent. The treasury bled silver, peasants abandoned their fields, and nobles grew weary of endless levies. Yet Ivan pressed on, consumed by his vision. He wrote letters to Elizabeth I of England, offering trade privileges, and even proposing a dynastic marriage that might bind Russia to the powerful Tudor throne. He dreamed of an alliance that would strengthen his hand against Europe and secure Russia's place among the great kingdoms. But such dreams never bore fruit. England welcomed trade,
but not a bond with the unpredictable Tsar. At home, Ivan's ambitions were increasingly shadowed by paranoia. As defeats mounted and resources dwindled, he began to see enemies not only beyond Russia's borders, but within them. Whispers of betrayal filled his court. Who among the boyars truly supported him? Who secretly conspired with Poland or Lithuania? Suspicion seeped into his mind, growing stronger as the war dragged on. And then came the greatest blow of all, the death of Anastasia, his beloved wife. She had been his anchor, the gentle hand that soothed his violent temper, the light that softened his gaze. When illness struck her down in 1560, Ivan was shattered. Grief turned to fury. He was certain that she had not died of natural causes, but had been poisoned by the treacherous boyars. In his heart, sorrow and suspicion became inseparable. The war abroad and the mourning at home intertwined, feeding the storm within him. As the Livonian War consumed his armies, Ivan turned his wrath inward. If Russia faltered, he would root out those responsible, even if it meant tearing apart the very foundations of his realm. His vision of expansion, of a Russia on the Baltic, had begun as a dream of glory. But now it was entwined with fear and vengeance. The dream of a window to the west became a crucible in which the Tsar's darker instincts were forged. And so, as foreign enemies pressed on Russia's borders, a new war was about to begin. Not against Swedes or Poles, but against Ivan's own people. It would be a war waged not with armies in the field, but with terror in the streets, midnight arrests, and rivers running red with blood. The Livonian War had awakened Ivan's ambition, but it also awakened his wrath. And soon, the Tsar would unleash a force more terrible than any foreign foe. The Oprichnina.
Chapter 6. The Shadow of Loss. The Kremlin bells tolled with a mournful cadence in the summer of 1560, and with their echoes, a darkness fell over the Tsar of Russia. Anastasia Romanovna, the first and most beloved wife of Ivan IV, was gone. She was not merely a consort, but the anchor of his restless soul, the gentle presence who softened his temper and gave balance to his fiery will. In her, the boy who had grown up among treacherous boyars had found trust. In her embrace, the Tsar had found peace, and now that peace was shattered. The sickness that took her had been sudden, cruel, and merciless. One day she was by his side, smiling, offering him words of comfort as he brooded over the setbacks in Livonia. The next, she was bedridden, her body weakened by fever, her eyes dim with exhaustion. Physicians came and went, offering prayers, herbs, and rituals, but none could save her. When death finally claimed her, Ivan was inconsolable. He wept not as a Tsar, but as a man torn apart. Yet grief alone did not define his mourning. In Ivan's mind, sorrow was inseparable from suspicion. He could not accept that Anastasia had simply fallen ill. Poison, he was certain, had been the cause. And who but his enemies, the boyars who had humiliated him in childhood, the nobles who resented his reforms, the conspirators who wished to see him weakened? Who but they would strike at him by striking down his queen? The thought consumed him. Day and night he raged in the halls of the Kremlin. His courtiers trembled as he accused them of treachery, his eyes wild with fury. The boyars protested their innocence, but their words were meaningless to a man who saw betrayal in every glance, in every whisper. To Ivan, Anastasia's death was not fate, it was murder, and Russia itself had conspired against him. The grief was compounded by exhaustion.
The Livonian War drained the treasury. Fields lay barren, and the people suffered under the weight of taxes and conscription. Ivan's once bright vision of a strong, united Russia seemed to dim, flickering like a candle in a storm. And in that storm, his mind grew darker, less steady, more ruthless. Some chroniclers wrote that after Anastasia's death, Ivan was never the same. The fiery but ambitious young ruler who dreamed of law, order, and greatness gave way to a Tsar who trusted no one and struck first out of fear. His laughter became sharper, his silences longer, and his punishments harsher. He sought enemies everywhere, and where none existed, he created them. In the shadow of his grief, Ivan began to withdraw from the structures of power he himself had built. The chosen council, once his trusted advisors, fell from favor. He dismissed them, accusing them of betrayal, of secret dealings with foreign powers. Some were banished, others executed. The partnership of Tsar and council, which had marked the hopeful beginning of his reign, was broken. Even the church, once his ally, could not restrain him. Priests and metropolitans urged him toward forgiveness, to see in Anastasia's death the inscrutable will of God. But Ivan's faith, once strong, had twisted into a different shape. He no longer sought consolation, but justification. If God had taken his wife, then perhaps it was a sign that the Tsar alone must wield divine vengeance on earth. And so, the seeds of the Oprichnina were sown. Ivan began to imagine a Russia divided, one part loyal to him, the other infested with traitors. If he could not root them out through reform, then he would root them out through terror. He would create a new order, an army of black-clad horsemen bound only to him, who would cleanse the land of treachery with fire and blood. But in those early days of grief, before the terror began, Moscow was filled with a strange silence. The court no longer echoed with Anastasia's laughter, and the Tsar's heart no longer knew gentleness. He paced through the gilded chambers of the Kremlin like a restless shadow, haunted by memories of her voice, her smile, the touch of her hand. The man who had once been tempered by love now found only iron within himself. The boy, who had been shaped by cruelty, was now the Tsar, who would wield cruelty as his weapon. From this shadow, a new chapter of Ivan's reign began. It was no longer a story of ambition and reform, but of vengeance and fear. Russia, once poised to rise upon the foundations of law and faith, was about to descend into an age of darkness, where the Tsar's grief became the people's torment. And the first act of this new age would soon be revealed: the birth of the Oprichnina.
Chapter 7. The Oprichnina. The death of Anastasia had broken something within Ivan IV. What remained of the young reformer, the Tsar, who once dreamed of a strong and orderly Russia, was buried beneath suspicion and rage. In its place rose a man who saw treachery lurking in every shadow, betrayal whispered in every corner of his court. And from this darkness, Ivan conceived one of the most feared institutions in Russian history, the Oprichnina. In 1565, Ivan shocked his people by abruptly abandoning Moscow. He retreated with his family and treasures to the town of Alexandrov, leaving behind the kingdom in confusion. Letters soon arrived declaring his abdication. The Tsar renounced his throne, accusing the boyars, clergy, and officials of treason. Panic spread like wildfire. Without Ivan, who would rule? Who could keep the state from collapsing into chaos? When the envoys of the church and the people pleaded for his return, Ivan revealed his plan. He would rule again, but only under new terms. Russia would be divided into two realms: the Zemshchina, governed by the old institutions and traditional nobility, and the Oprichnina, governed directly by the Tsar and his chosen men. In this domain, Ivan would be free of restraint, answerable to no boyar council, no ancient custom. He alone would wield the power of life and death. The Oprichniki were unlike any force Russia had seen before. Dressed in black robes, riding black horses, they carried with them symbols of their purpose: a broom to sweep away treachery, and the dog's head to sniff out betrayal. They became Ivan's personal army of terror, bound not to law or tradition, but to the Tsar's will. Wherever they rode, fear followed. At first, their task seemed clear: to crush disloyalty among the boyars, to strip the nobility of power that might rival the throne. Estates were seized, families uprooted, wealth confiscated. Boyars who had once stood proud in gilded halls were dragged away in chains, their blood staining the cobblestones of Moscow. But soon the terror spread beyond the noble class. Towns accused of disloyalty were punished, merchants suspected of greed were ruined, peasants caught in suspicion vanished into the shadows of prisons. The line between guilt and innocence blurred, until only Ivan's word defined reality. To be accused was to be condemned. The Oprichniki enforced their master's wrath with ruthless spectacle. Public executions filled the squares of Moscow. Victims were tortured, mutilated, humiliated before the eyes of the people. Some chroniclers tell of boyars sewn into bearskins and torn apart by dogs, of men boiled alive, of women paraded naked through the streets before death. Whether every tale is true or not, they reveal the fear that gripped the land. And Ivan reveled in it. To him, the Oprichnina was not cruelty, but purification. Russia, he believed, was a body riddled with disease. The boyars were its infection, corruption its fever. Through terror, he would cut away the sickness and forge a new loyal state. His enemies called it madness, but to Ivan, it was divine justice. He saw himself as God's avenger, wielding the sword of wrath upon a sinful nation. Yet, the Oprichnina did more than purge enemies. It weakened the realm it claimed to protect. Fields were left untended as peasants fled the terror. Trade faltered as merchants feared confiscation. Armies suffered as resources were diverted into Ivan's private domain. Even the church, once his ally, watched in horror as sacred laws were broken and blood was spilled without repentance. Still, Ivan pressed forward. His Oprichniki became his companions not only in terror, but in grotesque entertainments. Feasts turned into scenes of sadistic revelry, where executions mingled with drunken laughter. The Tsar, once a ruler who sought God's blessing, now blurred the line between faith and fury. He attended prayers with tears in his eyes, then signed death warrants with steady hand. To many, he seemed both penitent sinner and unrepentant tyrant, a contradiction that defied understanding. The people endured, powerless beneath the weight of the Tsar's will. They whispered prayers in their homes, begging for mercy, but none came. For nearly a decade, the Oprichnina reigned as a shadow kingdom, its riders sowing dread across the land. But in time, even Ivan's fury burned too hot to sustain. The land weakened, the treasury emptied, and enemies beyond Russia's borders grew bolder. The Oprichnina, which was meant to strengthen Russia, instead fractured it, leaving wounds that would take generations to heal. And yet, Ivan was not finished. His wrath had already scarred Moscow,
but soon it would descend upon an entire city. The greatest and most terrible act of the Oprichnina was yet to come: the massacre of Novgorod.
Chapter 8. Cities in Blood. Snow lay heavy upon the rooftops of Novgorod in the winter of 1570, but its silence was shattered by the thunder of hooves. Black riders poured through the gates, the Oprichniki, Ivan's dreaded agents, their banners fluttering like ravens' wings. Behind them rode the Tsar himself, grim and implacable, his face pale against the frost. The city, proud and ancient, was about to be drowned in blood. For centuries, Novgorod had stood as a city of merchants and free spirits, its people proud of their traditions of autonomy. Though long brought under Moscow's rule, whispers still lingered of its independent past. Now, in Ivan's mind, these whispers became treasonous shouts. He believed Novgorod had plotted to betray him, to open its gates to Lithuania, to deliver Russia's soul into the hands of foreign enemies. The accusation may have been born of paranoia, but paranoia had long since become Ivan's truth. And so the Tsar marched with thousands of Oprichniki to cleanse the city of its imagined betrayal. At first, Novgorod's bells rang in welcome, its clergy and officials meeting the Tsar with icons and bread, as custom dictated. But their gestures of loyalty found no mercy. Ivan's eyes were cold, his heart set on vengeance. The feigned greetings, he declared, were but masks for treachery. And so the trials began. But these were no trials in truth. The Oprichniki dragged citizens into the squares, accused them of conspiracy, and executed them with brutal swiftness. Boyars, merchants, priests, monks, peasants, none were spared. Families were torn apart, entire households exterminated. Wealth was confiscated, homes looted, treasures carried away in sledges that glided over snow stained red. Some chroniclers wrote of horrors that defy belief. Victims were bound and cast into the Volkhov River, their bodies breaking through the ice to vanish beneath its freezing waters. Men, women, and children alike were hurled into the current, their screams swallowed by the rushing tide. The river, it was said, ran thick with blood and corpses, a ghastly offering to the Tsar's vengeance. Monasteries were not exempt. Monks accused of harboring disloyalty were beaten, tortured, slain. Icons were torn from their places, relics desecrated. The holy places of Novgorod, once sanctuaries, became stages of terror. Even churches, echoing with prayers for mercy, saw their doors broken down by black-clad riders. And always, at the heart of it, was Ivan. He presided over the slaughter, not as a distant ruler, but as a participant. At times, he watched with grim satisfaction. At others, he personally struck down those condemned by his fury. To him, the massacre was not madness, but judgment. Novgorod had sinned, and he, as God's chosen Tsar, was the instrument of divine wrath. The terror lasted for weeks. Fires consumed the city, its once thriving markets reduced to ash, its proud citizens reduced to corpses. Tens of thousands are said to have perished, though the exact number is lost to history. Whether 30,000 or 60, the scale of suffering was immense, and the memory of it carved a scar into Russia's soul. When at last the Oprichniki withdrew, Novgorod was a shadow of itself. Its wealth plundered, its population broken, its spirit crushed. The city would never again rival Moscow. Ivan had extinguished not just lives, but the very independence of Novgorod's identity. Novgorod was no longer a proud city-state. It was a cautionary tale, a warning to all who might challenge the Tsar's will. But what had the massacre achieved? To Ivan, perhaps it was a triumph, proof that none could defy him. Yet for Russia, it was a calamity. The land weakened further, trade collapsed, and fear stifled growth. Foreign enemies grew bolder, sensing the fragility within. And the people, who once might have seen Ivan as a protector against the boyars, now trembled at the very sound of his name. In the years that followed, Ivan's reign grew heavier with suspicion, darker with cruelty. The Oprichnina, already feared, became synonymous with oppression. The blood of Novgorod marked a turning point, a descent from which Russia could not easily return. And yet, within the Tsar's heart, a strange contradiction endured. Ivan the Terrible saw himself as both executioner and penitent. After rivers of blood had been spilled, he would retreat to churches, weeping and praying for forgiveness. He confessed his sins, yet justified them as necessary, the burden of a ruler chosen by God. He was both sinner and saint in his own mind, both monster and savior. The massacre of Novgorod revealed the full measure of that duality. Ivan believed he had struck down traitors to save Russia, but to the survivors and to the generations that remembered, he had become a tyrant whose wrath consumed his own people. The city lay silent when the riders departed. Its bells cracked, its markets empty, its river haunted by the memory of the dead. And as winter deepened, the Tsar returned to Moscow, carrying with him not only spoils of war, but the weight of a legacy drenched in blood. The land he had sworn to unite was now bound not by loyalty, but by fear. And though the Oprichnina had triumphed in Novgorod, it had also revealed the cost of Ivan's reign, a kingdom consumed by its own shadows.
Chapter 9. The Foreign Stage. Though Ivan IV's reign was consumed by wars and terror at home, his ambitions were never confined to Russia's borders. He was not content to be a ruler of forests and steppes alone. He longed for recognition on the grand stage of Europe. In his mind, Moscow was no longer a distant principality, but the heir to Byzantium, the third Rome, the final guardian of Orthodox Christendom. And if Russia was to take its rightful place among the great powers, its Tsar must be acknowledged as their equal. Ivan's first great attempt at such recognition came through the Baltic. The Livonian War, though draining and disastrous in many respects, was not merely about land, it was about prestige. To secure a port on the Baltic meant access to the bustling arteries of trade that linked the kingdoms of the West. Ivan envisioned Russian merchants exchanging goods in London and Lubeck, Russian envoys walking the halls of European courts, Russian power shaping the destinies of distant nations. In pursuit of this vision, Ivan opened communication with one of Europe's most formidable monarchs, Elizabeth I of England. Their letters, preserved to this day, reveal a relationship at once strange and revealing. Ivan wrote to her not as a supplicant, but as an equal, sometimes even as a superior. He spoke of the hardships of kingship, of treachery among his nobles, of the loneliness of sovereign power. His tone was alternately commanding and plaintive, as though he sought both recognition and sympathy. At times, his letters carried unexpected proposals. He suggested an alliance between England and Russia, one that might stand against the ambitions of Poland and Sweden. More boldly still, he proposed marriage, first between himself and Elizabeth, and later, after recognizing the improbability of such a union, between Elizabeth and one of his sons. Such a bond, he argued, would strengthen ties between their realms and bring Russia into the family of European dynasties. Elizabeth, cautious and calculating, entertained his correspondence but offered little in return. She welcomed trade,
English merchants of the Muscovy Company found great profit in Russian goods like furs and timber, but she gave no serious thought to binding her fate to Ivan's. To her, he was a distant monarch, valuable for commerce, but unstable in character, dangerous to embrace too closely. Ivan's frustrations grew. He accused Elizabeth of treating him with less respect than he deserved, of sending envoys who carried more arrogance than honor. At times, his words revealed the sting of wounded pride, for beneath his titles and victories, Ivan remained haunted by the humiliations of his youth. Recognition from Europe was not just political, it was personal. To be slighted was to reopen old wounds. Beyond England, Ivan's relations with Europe were equally complex. He watched with suspicion as Poland and Lithuania, united under a single crown, grew stronger. Their kings courted alliances with Sweden and courted the Pope in Rome, tightening a Catholic net around Orthodox Russia. To Ivan, this was not only a political threat, but a spiritual one. He saw himself as the bulwark against heresy, the lone Orthodox Tsar, standing firm while the West plotted to swallow his people's faith. Yet, he was not blind to the West's achievements. Reports from travelers and ambassadors fascinated him. He marveled at European fortresses, at their guns and ships, at their scholars and engineers. In his darker moods, he envied them. He longed to bring such expertise to Russia, to raise Moscow to the level of Paris, London, and Rome. And so, he invited foreign artisans, builders, and military men to his court, seeking to graft Western skill onto Russian soil. But there was always a tension within him, for though he admired Europe's strength, he despised its arrogance. He would accept its knowledge, but not its dominance. He would trade with its merchants, but not bow to his kings. He would learn from the West, but only so that Russia might one day surpass it. And so Ivan stood, straddling two worlds, the medieval realm of Orthodox Russia, bound by tradition and faith, and the emerging modern Europe, driven by trade and ambition. His letters to Elizabeth were not only about alliances or marriages, they were about his place in history. He demanded to be seen, to be remembered, not as a barbarian czar from the frozen East, but a monarch who shaped the fate of nations. Yet, while he looked outward, the shadows at home deepened. The Livonian War dragged on, consuming men and silver. The Oprichnina spread terror, hollowing the strength of the state. And as Ivan sought recognition abroad, his own people began to wonder if the price of his vision was too high. Still, in his heart, Ivan believed he stood alone, a ruler set apart, both feared and misunderstood. He had conquered Kazan, built St. Basil's, humbled Novgorod, and written to queens and kings. To him, these were not the deeds of a tyrant, but of a sovereign chosen by God to carve Russia's path. And yet, the contradictions of his soul only grew sharper. For even as he dreamed of being honored by Europe, his wrath at home would soon reach its most infamous act, an explosion of fury that would stain not just his reign, but his very bloodline. Chapter 10: The Tsar's Wrath and Madness. By the late 1570s, the burden of war, suspicion, and grief had twisted Ivan IV into a man scarcely recognizable from the young Tsar who had once dreamed of glory and renewal. The boy who had longed for order and greatness had become a ruler consumed by rage, distrust, and uncontrollable impulses. His victories were overshadowed by endless conflict, his reforms drowned by blood, and his dreams of recognition abroad mocked by repeated setbacks at home. The Livonian War dragged into its third decade, a grinding stalemate that drained Russia's strength. Sweden and Poland pressed hard, seizing towns and fortresses that had once flown the banner of Moscow. The treasury was nearly empty, the peasants exhausted, the nobility fractured. Famine swept across the land, leaving villages desolate and corpses in the fields. Yet still Ivan demanded more. More soldiers, more silver, more sacrifices. He believed only unbending will could save Russia, but his people saw only the cruelty of a ruler who demanded everything while offering nothing but terror in return. It was in this climate of despair and exhaustion that Ivan's darkest hour came. The tale is infamous, preserved not only in chronicles but in art: the murder of his own son, Ivan Ivanovich, heir to the throne. The prince was strong, capable, and admired by many. He had grown into the very kind of ruler Ivan had once dreamed of being: bold yet disciplined, devout yet pragmatic, commanding respect both at home and abroad. For a time, it seemed that the dynasty's future was secure in his hands. Yet perhaps that was what stoked the Tsar's envy and fear. Ivan's mind, long poisoned by suspicion, could not accept that anyone, even his own flesh and blood, might surpass him. The breaking point came during a furious argument in November of 1581. Accounts differ on what sparked it. Some say Ivan, paranoid of betrayal, had struck the prince's pregnant wife in a fit of rage, causing her to miscarry. The young Ivan, horrified, confronted his father with bitter words. Others suggest the quarrel arose from political matters: the Tsar's erratic policies, the endless wars, the brutal Oprichnina. Whatever the truth, father and son clashed in a storm of fury. The Tsar, his temper always a roaring fire, seized his staff and struck. One blow, perhaps never meant to kill, fell upon his temple. Blood poured forth, the prince staggered, and in that instant, Ivan realized what he had done. He had struck not just his heir, but the very future of Russia. Cradling the dying prince in his arms, Ivan's fury dissolved into anguish. Chronicles say he wailed like a wounded beast, pressing cloth to the wound, begging his son for forgiveness, screaming for help that could not come. The great Tsar, who had commanded armies and terrified nations, was reduced to a father watching his own legacy bleed out before his eyes. The prince lingered for days, but the wound was mortal. When at last he died, Moscow fell into stunned silence. The heir was gone, and with him, Russia's hope for stability. The dynasty had been shattered by the very hand meant to secure it. The image of that moment, Ivan, his face twisted with horror, clutching his lifeless son, would haunt Russia forever. Centuries later, the painter Ilya Repin would capture it in his masterpiece, Ivan the Terrible and His Son, on November 16, 1581. A canvas so powerful that it unsettled even the Tsar's distant descendants. In the painting, Ivan's wide, tormented eyes burn with the realization of what cannot be undone, while the son's limp body lies cradled in desperate arms. History and legend meet in that image, the conqueror brought low by his own hand. After this tragedy, Ivan was never the same. His rage still flared, but it was hollow, empty. The weight of guilt pressed on him, bending his shoulders, dimming the fire in his eyes. He remained Tsar, but the people no longer saw a ruler chosen by God. They saw a broken man, cursed by his own violence. Russia too bore the scar. With the death of the heir, the dynasty's future fell upon Ivan's younger, weaker son, Fyodor, gentle in spirit but unsuited for rule. The great victories and conquests of Ivan's early reign now seemed like distant dreams. What lay ahead was uncertainty, weakness, and the looming shadow of crisis. The wrath of the Tsar had claimed many victims: nobles, peasants, cities, entire armies. But in striking his son, Ivan had destroyed the very thing he had sought to protect: the continuity of his dynasty, the stability of his throne,
the legacy of his reign. The boy who had once prayed in the Kremlin, the Tsar who had built St. Basil's, the conqueror of Kazan, the terror of Novgorod, the dreamer of Baltic seas, all of it now seemed to collapse into one tragic figure. A man who had risen higher than any Russian before him, only to fall into madness, grief, and infamy. Ivan IV would live a few more years, but the Russia he left behind was not the empire of his dreams. It was a land scarred by war, famine, and suspicion, its people weary, its dynasty weakened, its ruler remembered not only as a conqueror, but as a tyrant who had struck down his own blood. The legacy of the terrible was sealed, not by his victories, but by his wrath.
Chapter 11. The Final Years. The final years of Ivan IV's life were like the slow fading of a storm. The thunder still rumbled, the lightning still struck, but the great tempest had already spent its greatest fury. He remained Tsar, seated on the throne of Moscow, but he was no longer the formidable figure who had ridden to Kazan, built St. Basil's, and defied the princes of Europe. Age, grief, and the weight of his own deeds bending the once fiery ruler into a shadow of himself. The murder of his son, Ivan Ivanovich, had left him hollow. The court whispered of his breakdowns, moments when the Tsar would stare into nothing, muttering to himself, or burst into sudden weeping, as if haunted by visions only he could see. At times, he would lash out with the old fury, roaring commands, accusing boyars of treachery, demanding confessions of crimes both real and imagined. But the power behind the rage had waned. Where once his enemies trembled at the very mention of his name, now many endured his wrath with weary resignation. Russia itself reflected its ruler's decline. The Livonian War, dragged out for over 20 years, ended in failure. Instead of gaining the Baltic, Russia lost ground, ceding territories to Poland and Sweden. The dream of a window to the west, which had once burned so brightly in Ivan's mind, was now closed, leaving Russia landlocked and exhausted. The Oprichnina, too, ended in ruin, disbanded after years of bloodshed that had left the land scarred and its people broken. The terror had served only to weaken the very foundations of the state Ivan had sought to strengthen. In these years, Ivan turned increasingly to religion, though even here his devotion bore the marks of obsession and guilt. He prayed for hours, fasting, confessing his sins with dramatic fervor. He spoke often of his crimes, of the blood on his hands, of his fear that God would not forgive him. And yet, in the next breath, he might demand new executions, as if punishing others could somehow cleanse his own soul. Foreign ambassadors who visited Moscow in these final years painted a picture of a man torn between grandeur and decay. They described the Tsar as still commanding, still capable of flashes of brilliance in diplomacy and statecraft, but also erratic, unstable, and visibly weakened. His once powerful frame grew frail, his beard streaked with gray, his movements slower, his voice often hoarse. The fire had not gone out completely, but it burned low, flickering in the wind of time. Yet, even in decline, Ivan remained unpredictable. He could charm one moment and terrify the next. He continued to correspond with rulers abroad, still yearning for recognition as an equal among kings. He offered his daughter in marriage to foreign princes, schemed to expand his influence, and spoke of new campaigns that never materialized. But beneath the bravado lay the reality that his reign was nearing its end, and the world he had shaped would soon slip beyond his grasp. The court too knew it. Many boyars, once cowed by his terror, now whispered of succession. With the death of the capable Ivan Ivanovich, the throne would pass to Fyodor, the surviving son. Feeble in body and gentle in spirit, Fyodor lacked the strength to rule in the shadow of his father.
All knew that when Ivan's heart stopped, Russia would be thrust into uncertainty. Some feared it, others welcomed it, but none could deny it. And so, on March 18, 1584, in the Kremlin itself, the reign of Ivan the Terrible came to an end. Accounts say he was preparing to play a game of chess when he collapsed. Some whispered of poison, others of the slow erosion of age and guilt. Whatever the cause, the Tsar was gone. After more than 50 years on the throne, after wars, reforms, terrors, and triumphs, the first crowned Tsar of Russia lay lifeless, his restless spirit finally silenced. The reaction was mixed, as it had been throughout his life. Some wept, mourning the passing of a ruler who had defended Russia against countless enemies, who had expanded its borders and made Moscow a force to be reckoned with. Others sighed in relief, glad to see the end of a reign marked by blood and fear. For most, there was confusion. What future awaited Russia now? His body was laid to rest in the Archangel Cathedral, among the princes and rulers who had come before him. The bells tolled, priests chanted, and the people gathered to witness the passing of a man who had both protector and destroyer, saint and sinner, visionary and tyrant. With Ivan's death, Russia entered what would later be called the Time of Troubles. Years of famine, foreign invasion, and dynastic chaos. The strong hand of the Terrible was gone, and in its absence, the cracks he had tried to seal with terror widened into gaping wounds. His legacy was not stability, but uncertainty, not peace, but turmoil. And yet, even in failure, Ivan left a mark that could not be erased. He had been the first to bear the title of Tsar, the first to imagine Russia not as a fragmented realm of princes, but as a single, unified state with ambitions that stretched beyond its borders. He had built monuments, wars, struck fear into nations, and carved his name into the memory of the world. In the end, Ivan the Terrible was both more and less than he had dreamed. He was no saint, no perfect ruler, no eternal protector of the Russian land. But neither was he a mere tyrant, a madman without vision. He was both, a man of contradictions, whose greatness was inseparable from his cruelty, whose dreams were entangled with his nightmares. And so, when the Kremlin bells fell silent that day, they tolled not just for a Tsar, but for the passing of an age, the age of Ivan the Terrible, whose shadow would linger over Russia for centuries to come.
The Epilogue. The Shadow of the Terrible. The story of Ivan IV, known to history as Ivan the Terrible, is not easily told in simple terms. His reign was too vast, too contradictory, too marked by both light and shadow to be reduced to a single judgment. He was a boy who grew up in violence and neglect, who dreamed of greatness and brought his vision to life, yet who also unleashed horrors that scarred his people for generations. When we look back at his reign, we see first the achievements. He transformed Russia from a fragile collection of principalities into a centralized state with a crowned Tsar at its head. He conquered Kazan and Astrakhan, bringing the Volga under Moscow's control and expanding Russian influence deep into the east. He commissioned the building of St. Basil's Cathedral, a jewel of Russian architecture, whose colorful domes still rise above Red Square as a symbol of a nation. He corresponded with foreign monarchs, sought trade routes to the west, and envisioned Russia as a player on the European stage. And yet, we cannot speak of Ivan without also speaking of the blood. The Oprichnina, his personal reign of terror, spread fear across the land. The massacre of Novgorod, the midnight executions, the confiscations and tortures, these left a mark not only on his enemies, but on the soul of Russia itself. His paranoia destroyed the boyar class that had once guided the realm, leaving behind a weakened state that struggled after his death. The tragedy of his life was mirrored in the tragedy of his dynasty. By striking down his own heir, he doomed Russia to years of chaos. The time of troubles which followed his death was the direct consequence of his choices. The weakened nobility, the exhausted peasantry, the empty treasury, and the fragile line of succession. The dynasty he had fought so fiercely to strengthen cracked under the weight of his violence. Yet even his cruelties became part of the fabric of Russian history. Later rulers would look back to Ivan and see both a warning and a precedent. Some feared repeating his terror, while others imitated it. The idea of the Tsar as a figure above the law, accountable only to God, was reinforced by his reign. The people, though they suffered, grew accustomed to the notion of a ruler who could be both protector and punisher, father and executioner. It is this duality that defines Ivan's legacy. He was both visionary and tyrant, builder and destroyer. He loved Russia deeply, yet hurt it grievously. He sought to elevate his people, yet often treated them as expendable. He dreamed of placing Russia among the great powers of Europe, yet his methods left it weakened and isolated. Centuries later, Ivan's figure still looms large. Writers, historians, and artists have debated him endlessly. Was he truly Grozny, terrible in the sense of fearsome and awe-inspiring? Or was he simply mad, a ruler driven by his demons more than his visions? The truth lies somewhere in between. To his enemies, he was a tyrant. To some of his people, he was a necessary force in a dangerous age. To history, he remains both. Even today, the echoes of Ivan's reign linger in Russia's memory. Saint Basil stands as a testament to his victories, while the stories of the Oprichnina and the death of his son serve as cautionary tales of unchecked power. His life is told in chronicles, in paintings, in legends that continue to shape how Russians see their past. In the quiet of the Kremlin, where his bones lie among the rulers who came before him, one can almost imagine the restless spirit of the terrible Tsar. Perhaps he still paces the shadowed halls, torn between pride in what he built and torment over what he destroyed. Perhaps he still whispers prayers for forgiveness or curses the boyars he once despised. Perhaps he lingers not as a ghost, but as a symbol. A reminder that greatness and cruelty often walk hand in hand. The story of Ivan the Terrible is not just the story of a man. It is the story of Russia in its formative age, a land struggling to find unity, strength, and identity in a world of shifting powers. His reign was both the making and the breaking of Russia, setting patterns that would echo for centuries. As the bells toll over Moscow, as the domes of St. Basil's catch the light of the setting sun, we remember Ivan not with simple judgment, but with awe. For he was not merely a king or a tyrant, but a man who embodied the vastness, the contradictions, and the relentless spirit of the land he ruled. And so, the tale of Ivan the Terrible ends not with peace, but with questions. Was he the protector of Russia or its destroyer? Was he chosen by God or driven by demons? The answers remain elusive, as complex as the man himself. But one truth endures. Ivan IV left behind a legacy that cannot be forgotten. His shadow stretches across centuries, reminding us of the cost of power, the fragility of greatness, and the terrible weight of history.